Hey, folks, welcome back. This is Mark Devine with the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Thanks for joining me today. Super stoked to have you here. As you know, I don't take it lightly with all the things vying for your attention. So we're going to bring you some valuable information and not waste your time. If you do enjoy this podcast, please go rate it wherever you listen. iTunes is a great place to do it. We have over 1,000 5-star reviews. So it helps other people find it and also value the podcast. And so I appreciate that as well. I'm excited today to be talking to Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. I hope I got your name correct.
You did, just like it sounds.
Awesome. Sukhinder is a leading tech exec, entrepreneur, investor, board member. She's got over 25 years of experience with a couple small companies such as Google, Amazon, Yodlee. She's recently served as president of StubHub. You've heard of that. Helped to sell that in 2020 for a few $billion. And that company's thrived under her leadership. She's the founder and chairman of the Board List. She's been profiled in many, many publications and has a new book out called Choose Possibility, which I'm excited to talk about. Sukhinder, thanks so much for your time and for doing this podcast while you're traveling in LA from a hotel room.
It's all good. I wish I could come to San Diego next time, but thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So there's a lot that we could talk about, but I always like to kind of start out just getting to know and having the listeners just get to know a little bit about why you became who you are today. Like what were your formative experiences, you know, both the good and the bad, the challenges, as well as the opportunities that you're presented with that helped you become an executive, an entrepreneur, and then, you know, rise to the highest of ranks, so to speak, in the corporate world?
Well, that's a flattering way to describe it, but I'll give the answer.
Let's go with that, though. Let's
go with that. Let's go with it. So first and foremost, I always say to people, if you want to know what formed me, like many people, I am the daughter of entrepreneurs, in particular my father. My parents were both medical doctors who immigrated to Canada when I was young from Africa. But my dad loved running a medical practice as much as he loved serving people. And he loved the fact that it was a small business. When I was, I don't know, I would say to people when I was 6 or 7, not 6 or 7, maybe 7 or 8, my dad started us all doing like entries into his ledger. So that at tax time, you know, because you remember you still used to write out like
double entry bookkeeping.
Yeah, exactly. Double entry bookkeeping. It's absolutely true. So he had his whole family do it. We were 3 girls, and we would all be entering, you know, into his ledger expenses from his checkbook. And by the time I was 12 or 13, I probably understood how to do his tax return. And so you're like, what does that have to do with possibility and being an entrepreneur? And I'm like, turns out it's everything, right? Because when you witness somebody who goes to work every day, on the one hand, dreams of building a big business. My dad dreamed of opening like walk-in clinics, probably 15 years before that became a mainstream business concept. He saw the possibility for what, you know, an always open medical clinic could be. Yet, I mean, possibility was also like, hey, you know, it's as simple to run a business as sort of figuring out your expenses and your costs and like making sure that one exceeds the other. And so I think that my formative years, my father loved working for himself. He loved being an entrepreneur. He married impact with his vocation. And those were all like my formative lessons. And I remember when I was young, he used to tell me to work for myself. And then I went off to university and went to undergraduate business school. And I wanted to be a corporate executive. You know, feel like what it was like to be like, I don't know what it meant being an executive meant, but I wanted to do it. But probably by my mid-20s, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like I came all the way back to those lessons. Once I had a little bit of taste of corporate life, I'm like, I do want to create something. So that was probably the most formative thing, you know, if you would dial all the way forward. And then we would say,
can I pause you for a second?
Sure.
What age did you come over from Africa? And where did you grow up in Africa?
My parents, well, first of all, my parents are both Indian by descent.
Oh, okay.
But my father's family immigrated to Uganda. My mom was raised in India. And I was born in East Africa. My parents ran a medical practice there. And then they immigrated. And so this comes to this point, right, about like this immigrant mentality. My parents immigrated to Canada relatively late in their life. My dad was probably maybe early 40s. My mom was late 30s, maybe. And we were all very young, and they gave up, you know, prosperity in Africa to kind of start over and make sure their kids got a great education. They redid their residency. They moved into an apartment. They, you know, and they restarted their life. So,
so you didn't have did you have any formative experiences in Uganda that, you know, shaped your thinking at all?
I didn't. I would say my father certainly did. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
but I
you were
don't.
too.
But I think I was too young. I was 2 years
Mhm.
old, and when my parents moved to Canada.
I
But I
see.
think that so like were my parents risk takers in a classic sense? Well, no, but they took one big risk to start over, right?
Hmm.
And that worked out. And then, as I said, my father lived kind of taking little and big risks every day as an entrepreneur,
Hmm.
and I appreciate that now more than ever. That was the formative experience, and then everything since we can certainly go through my career,
Yeah, no.
but there were some formative decisions to come to Silicon Valley at a time that, in hindsight, was really good. Like I moved here
Hmm.
when in 1997, and unbeknownst to me, like from a macroeconomic perspective, that was a great time to move to Silicon Valley, right? The
Right.
tailwinds around internet usage were like lifting every tide, and
Hmm.
have continued to do so, by the way. So, of course, there's some bigger decisions I made or choices I made, and some smaller ones,
Hmm.
but certainly the credit goes to my dad.
So as you got into Silicon Valley and starting to navigate that, like what were some of the biggest challenges that you face? I mean, what was hard for you, and what did you had to, overcome
Yeah, I
to
think,
continue
well,
to grow?
um, let's talk about what was easier and then what was harder.
Sure.
Um, so I think what was easier is finding a place that welcomed my, generally speaking, aggressiveness, a relatively meritocratic environment where you could
Hmm.
be in your mid 20s and be a founder, right? So I would say a lot of like my values and how I operate were welcome. So I would say that is the macro context. For the
Hmm.
last 20 years, I've lived in an environment where who I am authentically mostly is rewarded, right?
Right. Hmm.
And then you say, well, what are the obstacles? And keep in mind, like, I always believe that you have to have some sense of clarity about your own life. Like, the obstacles I faced are like, these are, in the context of the world's problems, these are not obstacles.
Yeah,
In the
I
context
understand.
of
Yeah,
personal
I feel
growth,
the same way.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like, like, what are the obstacles? I'm like, well, gee, so let's put it in perspective. But in a podcast about career development and
Right.
being your best self, let's just appreciate
Right.
that I know my obstacles are all put in perspective. But I'd say there were two. Number one, I mostly thrived, as we talked about, but a couple times in my career, I didn't, right? My first job
Hmm.
in the Valley, I quit at 6 months. Fast forward, 12 years into my career, I was having lots of success. I became a first time CEO. I was out within 6 months. And if I
Mm.
were to look at those experiences and say, like, what were the organizations where I didn't thrive? I would say my values fit was fundamentally missing.
Hmm.
Maybe I put the what, like, oh, I really want to work in this industry or at this company, over the who. And when
Hmm.
I say that, I was like, when I put the what over the who, and I ended up in situations where I felt myself either subordinate to, or inextricably tied to somebody with whom my values didn't fit. In a startup, like, there's no place to go, right? It's like,
Right.
it's not like it's a division where you're like, hey, myself and this person don't share the same world for you. I'm just going to move to another division. And so
Right.
twice in my life, I quit startups.
Yeah.
And
There's one division.
there's one
Make this
division.
thing
That's
work. Make this thing work.
it. Make this thing work, right? So I would say one big obstacle set in my career, which many of us have, is like, when you take a risk, what do you bet on? And I would say, like, betting on the who is a disproportionate bet for most of us. And twice
Hmm.
I think I've
Hmm.
gotten the who wrong, and we can talk about that. And then I would say the up and so I think that's one macro theme. And then I
Hmm.
think the other thing is just recognize. I always say to people, it's called risk for a reason, right? When we all try and take risks, the best we can do is be a calculated risk taker.
Hmm.
And so often we believe that when we succeed or we fail, it's about us. People are like, oh, Sukhinder, you must be great. And I'm like, well, let's be clear. We choose our responses to the environment we're in,
Right.
but reading the macro headwinds and tailwinds and trying to time your entry or exit into a situation right is itself like either a huge proponent of your success or an obstacle. So I would say the other places I haven't succeeded, it's not because I didn't pivot and try and iterate. Sometimes, particularly in a world of like internet tailwinds and headwinds, I was like too early. It, like, my
Right.
first company, Yodely, we were way too early as a fintech app. Luckily
Hmm.
for us, we survived and raised enough money, and then fintech became an enormous category, but it took us
Hmm.
15 years to build a public company. My second company, Joyous, I mean, I was doing video commerce in 2010. Let me tell you, nobody believed you could sell something through video online.
Interesting.
When I tried to raise money for my company in 2017, like, I couldn't get it done, right? And look, the unit economics weren't working out.
Hmm.
4 years later, like, video commerce is everybody's like new sweetheart category. Everybody
Hmm.
wants to build a video commerce company. So sometimes when we have obstacles, it's because, we we think it's all about us, but in fact, you have to be reading the tea leaves about what's going on around you. So I believe in two things. I believe that we can position ourselves really best for success when we find people and environments in which we can thrive. And when we read the macro headwinds and tailwinds, and try and ride tailwinds and, identify how to pivot in headwinds. And yet, despite all that, there are sometimes when macro beats micro, and
For
you
sure.
can be perfect on execution, but you can't execute your way out of a bad market, right? So if I were to look at obstacles, some are very business driven and some are obviously choice driven by choices I made, where in hindsight, I'm like, okay, if I had to redo that choice, what are the lessons I take away from
Right. To lead a technology company, do you have to be a technology person? I mean, do you consider yourself techie? Like, you understand the underlying nuts and bolts of how the tech works?
it? Well, now I'm not an engineer. I had a
Right.
business undergrad. Um, I don't think you have to be a technologist, but I think you have to love creative problem solving. I
Right.
think you have to be able to have empathy with whoever your end user is. And I
Hmm.
think you have to be curious, right? So now I know enough to be dangerous because I've been a co-founder to multiple technologists.
Hmm. Hmm.
I've been a CEO who's had to manage technologists, and now, I guess I love product design enough that if a product team comes into me and is designing a new service for consumers, I have a lot of opinions on the UEX because I've
Hmm.
had 20
Yeah.
years of looking at it. But am
Hmm.
I a technologist? No. I'm somebody who falls in love with problems around empowering or delighting people.
Hmm.
And I have empathy for a lot of different problems and I have a
Hmm.
lot of curiosity. And now just enough knowledge to be dangerous. But no, I'm
Hmm.
not a technologist.
So you're describing some really important qualities that a CEO or a leader needs to bring to the team.
Mhm.
And so I'd love to kind of get your take on, like, when you look at the role of the leader or the executive, chief executive, what should you not do
Mhm.
and what should you do more of?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, um, and keep in mind, I show up in most rooms as one of two types of leaders, depending on the situation. Number one is I've been a founder 3 times. So I have a lot of like founder genes. You know what I mean? For good
Right.
or for bad. Like
And
I
a
love,
founder as a CEO is going to be different than a hired gun CEO, for
you
sure.
got it, right? So
Yeah.
I've been a founder CEO and I've been a hired gun CEO.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and identify what's in common. I'd say when I show up with my founder hat on, it's mostly because I love to create and start
Yeah.
things from scratch and I get a lot of creative energy. And then when I've been a hired gun CEO, it's because I can own the kind of the end to end of kind of creating a delightful experience and I can scale it. I get a lot of leadership joy from trying to solve different problems, right? At the
Mhm,
same
mhm.
time, in parallel. It's very intellectually stimulating. What should a leader do more of? Well, I say to most leaders, if I were to give you one principle, it would go something like this. You enter most situations a leader, presuming that your best and highest use is to manage other people. And I think in many cases, the best and highest use of a leader is to have other people manage you. So people are
Interesting.
like, well, what do you mean? Right. Well, you and I both would like leaders think that the leverage, especially if you're a first time leader, you think the leverage is I'm going to manage people directly and, get the most out of them. But sometimes getting the most out of them is letting other people author and
Right.
come to you with their vision and then
Right.
to add your insight on top of it. And
Right.
many leaders, myself included, I have lots of opinions. If you walk into an office with me and you have no opinion, I always say you're going to leave with my opinion because I always
Ah,
have an opinion, right? I'm not really sure that's the most empowered place to be for you or me because then I am directly managing you all the time,
right.
telling you what to do, and most leaders would tell you they get frustrated if they feel like they have to drive everything.
Mhm.
Yet, the definition of leadership for a lot of people is like managing people. And I'm like,
Right.
okay, just stop for a moment. Imagine if you said to everybody, your job is to manage me. Now, here's what that means. You walk into a room with your agenda. You walk in with your vision and your questions. You control the conversation with
Mhm.
me, which is not the way most people think about an interaction with their CEO,
Mhm.
and then tell me what questions you have. And then we're going to get into a really fun dialogue, right? And I will say to people, by the way, if you want to come when your plan is perfect and then you're offended if I give you any feedback, that's probably not a great way to go. But if you come in with no plan, you're going to leave with my plan. Also, not a very empowering place to be.
Mhm.
How about you come in at like when you're 75% baked? And then
Mhm.
you can actually actively manage me. You have conviction, you have a thesis, you have ideas, you have questions. And for me, that's a really fun interaction. It's really leveraged. We have a really quick, efficient, effective conversation. I learn a lot. Maybe I can give some insight that's useful, and you will leave feeling like, oh, maybe my plan is a little bit better, or I thought about this, or Sukhinder challenged me this way. but it's still, I came in like, right, holding my own and empowered. So I think if I had one thing that people should do more of, it's like try and turn around that principle. Don't presume that your main job as a leader is to manage people tightly. What would happen if you asked people to manage you in a structured way
Mm-hmm.
and come in empowered, right? But that means
Mm-hmm.
empowered, prepared, other things. It kind of shifts the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing I think you should do more of.
That's neat.
And I think if you, I call that the you manage me or I manage you principle. Which would you prefer? Do you want to manage me or do you want me to manage you? Like, honestly.
I take B.
Yeah, exactly. And then I would say the other one that I think people should do less of, you know, I think leaders believe they have to be perfect sometimes.
Mm.
And I think what people value is constructively, nobody wants to be spooked, authenticity, transparency,
Mm-hmm.
imperfection, because it gives other people the permission to do the same. So I think if the example we set as leaders is you have to be perfect, or I need to look perfect, it sets a standard where everybody thinks they need to look perfect, you know, and people don't take risks when they feel they need to be perfect. People don't pivot and iterate. They don't come to you and say, you know, my range of estimates on this product launch is actually we could do 10 million next quarter, we could do 30. And the you know, the variation in those numbers is going to be this and this and this situation. So I'm going to try and manage for them. But if you come in and you say, like, the only good answer for Sukhinder is it has to be 30, and I'm going to protect that it's 30, like, think about all the dynamics that creates, right? So I believe like less of perfection,
That's perfect.
more of, you know, authenticity, transparency, being clear about the volatility in the situation, while always having a solution mindset.
You know, I love that. You know, in fact, I wrote a book about that topic. I called it Staring Down the Wolf. And the premise is kind of what you just said, is that oftentimes leaders are the limiting factor in the team
Yes.
because they do think they're supposed to have all the answers and they suck all the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah.
And so I broke it down into a few different principles, and I used my glorious screw ups to kind of highlight how not to do things.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I really talk about is it takes great courage to, as a leader, to admit that, you know, you don't have all the answers, and to admit that you have biases and also sometimes traumatic things that cause you to react in certain ways, or project certain things onto people. And so because guess what? You're human.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, and that's what we mean by authenticity, is to recognize that you're a freaking human who also happens to be CEO that day. So get over yourself.
Like, get over yourself. Well, first of all, get over yourself is a pretty good principle.
Right.
And look, I love that you sort of talk about learning from your scripts. Make no mistake, you can probably read it right through this video. Like, I am opinionated, I am impatient, I am a driver. So you can imagine all of the goodness of that, but you can imagine the badness of that is that people think.
Yeah. I saw a note that you scared your secretary. So
well, let's put it this way. Somebody told me that, and I was like, okay, like, really, that's ridiculous. But anyway, I was 27 years old at the time, so it was a weird thing to say to me. But the point being, the derivative of my own leadership style is lots of people come in and think the only right answer is my answer, right? Or if I have an opinion, that must be the truth, as opposed to like, it's my opinion. Or if I ask 5 questions, that I must be trying to get to something, when often for me, the way I learn is I just ask lots of questions.
So you're saying there's an attribution bias placed on you because of your success already, your past success.
Well, actually, I would say there's a lot of biases placed because of my style. Let's not put it on anyone else. So I think I think, to your point, let's go further, and like, what should you do more of as a leader? Be more self-aware, and like, and I would just say, own your own biases, to your point, and your style, so that you can give people permission to say, like, hey, like, you know, this is who I am. This is what it's going to be like to work with me. Now, when I hire new leaders who are going to work closely with me, I wanted them to know what it's like, because I'm looking for my complement, right? I'm looking for people who understand how to hold me, and they're not afraid of it. They're like, look, I'm like, this is who I am. That doesn't mean it's wrong or right. It just means that, like, you have to be able to hold your own and give me feedback, or to, like, don't presume that because I have this style, I think I'm always right, or what have you. So I think you kind of have to own your flaws. And be relatively clear with people on, like, yes, these are the good things about myself, and these are the things that, you know, can create angst. I learned long ago that, you know, like, when I'm in brainstorming mode, you think you can be in brainstorming mode as a CEO. Guess what? When you're in brainstorming mode as a CEO, everybody walks out of the room and thinks, like, what? We have to do that and that and that and that. And I'm like,
I am such a victim of that. Oh my gosh. I have to recluse myself because
Right.
everyone takes it as a direction. And I'm
That's
like, no, wait. I'm just talking. I'm just,
yeah, right. Like, wait, I was just like brainstorming, like, hold on a second, right?
wait,
But
hold on.
those are all the derivative impacts we create as CEOs. And you can't just say that's on other people, that's on us.
Right.
So like you kind of want to create environments where you acknowledge your own style and what that might be doing. And you also want to create structures around it. So like
Right.
the last thing I would just say is for somebody like my own style and my team will chuckle. You were saying like you wrote a book based on your flaws. There's no doubt, like it's very easy for a whole room to attune to what I'm saying because I have a lot to say on anything. The converse is like if I actively want to make the team brainstorm, I literally have to pick myself out of the seat on the table I'm sitting in as the CEO, and I go to the whiteboard and I pick up a pen and I'm like, okay,
You're the
everybody,
scribe.
what do you think? I have to move myself mentally to scribe in order to get people to shift out of that mode, right? Where everybody is like turned to me and listening to like what I have to say. Those are the types of tactics you have to use for yourself once you know your style, right? As a leader. So it's not on your team, it's on you, to be clear.
How have you handled the negative Nilly or the individual on your team who happens to be the person who's bringing everyone else down to his or her lowest common denominator? Because that's something I learned in the SEAL teams. Like the teams that are firing in all cylinders are the ones that are, the operating elite level is where everyone, every individual is willing to admit their own shit. Every individual is willing to receive feedback. Everyone individual is willing to check their ego at the door. And the teams that couldn't operate that way, it was often just one guy.
Yes.
And they didn't have the courage to get them off the team. So how do you handle that?
Well, I think you've hit it. The reality is once you have been a leader long enough, to your point, you learn that the hardest cost, the regrets we often have are like when there was a person who should have been given feedback or who should move on or wasn't a fit and wasn't able to take the feedback. And after repeated attempts, we all sort of like shy away from that conversation, and the cost to the organization is quite high. So to answer your question, I'm probably pretty similar to you. I'm like, okay, how do you get this person feedback? But keep in mind, I think when we say you've got to get that person feedback, it's hard to give people feedback once. You have to give people feedback early and often. Right? You can't say like, it's on this person. Well, I don't know about you. Do you know how many boards I've sat on where the CEO never gets feedback from the board? It's like, it's incredible how scared we are to give feedback. So you can't just put it on that person if you've not given them the opportunity for feedback early, often. And if like what I've often found is if you can find them receptive to feedback and coaching, like we all are, I have to take a lot of coaching. I've had it all my life. I continue to have a coach. Then I think it's redeemable. But I always think that what is irredeemable is people who put themselves ahead of the team. That's really hard. Like somebody who's like optimizing for the I, not the we. If it's somebody who's inherently pessimistic, but well-intentioned, then I think it might be coachable if you give them feedback and they want to take it. I think what's really hard to get out of team is the person who's always optimizing for the I and is negative. That's
problematic. Yeah, that's a deep character issue.
Yeah, that's it. And you do see that people are like optimizing for what makes them look good. But but look, I think what you're identifying is if there's a toxicity in a team driven by one individual, you have no choice but to get into a feedback cycle with them and a pretty definitive time frame in which to solve it.
Right.
I don't know of any better way. I have no secret sauce other than you got to do the hard work of
You got to have the critical conversations. You mentioned coaching and team development and personal development or leadership development, whatever label you want to put on it, are starting to become more and more, I was going to say popular, but almost looked at as necessary, especially kind of post-pandemic, because what seemed to be working before doesn't seem to be working now. And so I'm curious, have you leveraged coaching in your organization besides yourself? Have you thought, or do you bring coaching into your organization? Do you have a developmental model? What does that look like for you guys?
Well, I'll tell you what it's historically looked like and what I tested at StubHub. And I think it'll be what I test in whatever company I run next as well, because I think it has some teeth. So I'll come to it in a moment. My own coach came from YPO. So I was in YPO 2009, almost 11 years ago, because I was a first-time CEO and looking to figure it out. And ultimately, I thought YPO was good, but it was very time heavy,
time-consuming
commitment. So I kept the coach and left YPO. And that coach has been with me for 11 years. And so the first thing I did is because we talked about, like, whatever your strengths are as a leader are likely to have all their negative ramifications as well, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I would bring my coach into every organization I was in to meet my leadership team and do my 360.
Oh,
I
no
didn't,
kidding. Okay.
yeah, because I
Yeah.
didn't trust that the board would do it, and often
Hmm.
boards don't, particularly in
Hmm.
startups. They're very unorganized,
Right.
generally,
Right.
unfortunately. They're scared to give their CEOs feedback, particularly when their CEOs are founders. They're even more scared, which is not helpful,
Hmm.
right? So it's the opposite of early and often
Hmm.
feedback. It's like zero feedback. So if you're a CEO, you're like, where do you get your feedback? And nobody wants to tell you directly. So, I bought my coach in, and I had my coach interview my leadership team, because I knew two things would be true. Number one, they would trust him or her to take the feedback, anonymize it, and deliver to me in the way that it would best land. And I knew that that person had my best intentions at heart, and I didn't have to worry about whatever they were going to say to me, because they weren't also sitting on my board, right? A coach is a great person to give you that feedback, because, like,
Right.
there's no other agenda, right, than your
Right.
success.
Right.
You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So my first model was bringing a coach in to get feedback on me. Then, to your point, you're like, how do you create a feedback, system for your organization? So first of all, at any large organization we've always had learning and development organizations,
Hmm.
what you do, manager training, and so on. But I think as you get into the leadership levels, coaching, I think, is like historically done as a one-on-one thing. And then what we
Right.
tried at StubHub, which started to work, and then, then we ended up selling the company, but I want to try again, is for my leadership team, my coach created a mini YPO type model
Hmm. Yeah.
and I think this is why I think it's so powerful.
Hmm.
And it was starting to work. So this is like one thing for all of you to try if you have any curiosity around this. When we,
I have more than curiosity. I mean, I can't wait to hear this, but this is what
well,
we do as a company.
yeah, exactly. You're
That's how
hitting on
you,
it. So
yeah.
here's the thing. Most people who I've had in my career will come to me and say, Sukhinder, you have an executive coach. I'm an SVP. I want an executive coach. So you pay for them to get one-on-one
Right.
coaching.
Right.
But that coach is missing the context of the
That's
organization,
right.
right?
Right.
So that's really hard. So what
Yes.
you really want is a coach who maybe knows all the execs, so they can understand the back channel and the politics and each
Right.
person's personality and gifts. And then they can facilitate, right,
Hmm.
your team, because they have the context. So I found one, maybe a coach who is there and understands the context of the organization is a more interesting coaching model, right? So they're
Hmm.
coaching several members of the team. So there's
Hmm.
synergy. That's one
Hmm.
option. But the second thing my coach did, and we had multiple different, my coach was at StubHub, but we at one point had an external coaching organization. So park who the coach is for a moment. This idea that you're coaching a team
Hmm.
as well as individuals, there's synergy there. But then number two, what my coach did I thought was brilliant is he created mini YPO forums where they peer coach each other.
Hmm.
So let's say they're all having trouble with Sukhinder. As long as I'm comfortable in them all having a peer coaching session where they're coaching each other, what I know is they're teaching each other how they navigate situations. And that's pretty powerful, right?
That is great.
So the next organization I go to, I want to continue that model because I think there's something pretty powerful about
Mm.
bringing leaders together to peer coach each other. They're all learning from each other, as well as the facilitation of having like a coach there to give them one-on-one coaching when they need it, but with context.
Yeah.
Because I think otherwise, you have your coach, I have my coach, we all
Right.
have our coaches, but that doesn't help the team dynamic
That's
in
right.
a company, which is, by the way, where all the challenges are. Like
Right.
the challenges aren't like, am I great or what could I do better? The challenge is like, I'm in a situation where I'm getting triggered. Somebody else has their agenda. I have my agenda. We're butting heads. Like, right? Most of our challenges come in team situations with other people who are also trying to make their way through the world
That's
as a
right.
leader. And together we have to accomplish something. So I really
Yeah.
like this model.
It's a great model. In fact, what I was alluding to is we've been doing this now for several years as a service,
Yeah.
Unbeatable. So what we do is we go into organizations and our coaches will then go and form, with the
Yeah. Those teams.
support of the teams.
Yes.
And then those internal teams have curated or facilitated sessions with our coach, but then they also have sessions alone
Yes.
where it's just peer
Bingo.
group. And then we, and our whole objective is not just to help them work out their interpersonal issues and whatnot, but also to help them grow individually and as a team. So we work on that vertical growth. So we're giving them the skillful means to use, mindfulness and breath work and, stress reduction strategies like that. And then, and also get their exercise and their sleep and all the things that degrade performance or
Yes.
lead to breakdowns over time. So we bring those specialized skills in the team environment. And then on top of that, they get all this interpersonal
Dynamics, right? They're learning
dynamics and
yeah,
having the crucial conversations in that facilitated crucible the container of the forum or the group is really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I
It's a neat
think, look, I
model.
think the key, it's very powerful. I think the key is how do you keep it going in a frequency model? Because what
Right.
typically happens is
Yeah.
somebody will parachute in a team for an
That's
offering.
right.
And then
Yeah.
you'll have this like moment of truth and sharing, and then they
Yeah.
disappear, right?
Right.
And a lot of the conflict and frustration is in the day to day. So I like this
Mhm.
idea of like some like ongoing support,
Sure.
right? And
Yeah.
some structure to your point, so they can even solve among themselves.
Right.
Because often as a leader, you end up diving into solve among two people, right? And what you want them to
Right.
do is have the skill set, to
Right.
navigate with each other.
That's right. Yeah. That's neat. One of the principles that I've kind of am working on now is I think as we head into the VUCA world, right, which all been VUCA, but it's kind of been hidden under the surface. But there is no one person or one leader or one genius who can, see through the complexity and deal with the volatility and the uncertainty. So the team is the new leader. And
Yes.
to your point, the team should be the voice. The team should be the main thing,
Mhm,
not leader team, right?
mhm,
Me versus them, or
mhm.
it's we. And so that's a mindset shift. So it takes a little bit of time to get everyone kind of into that model. Like, hey, this is about us. It's about the mission first. It's about the team second. Within the
Mhm.
team, my teammates are first and I'm second.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean, that is like there are a few different leaps in there to be
Yeah.
made, right?
That's
I
right.
think that, um, and you would know this well because of your background. It's ironic because people always say to me, Sukhinder, like, how do you form relationships at work? And I always chuckle. I'm like, all the relationships I have at work, given my natural intensity where I don't stop and necessarily ask people about their families, which sounds terrible, but I'm so like, my head is filled with stuff. I come into work and I'm like,
I'm
oh,
the
I've got to
same
get
way.
this all done. But
Yeah.
I always say to people, I have the best relationships because I've been through fire with people. Like
Right.
I was like, I don't know that, like, I don't know how else to describe it. Like often, like, we go through these experiences together. And as a result of going through this, solving this problem together, we are bonded,
Mm-hmm.
which is different anyway. So I totally get it. I wouldn't say I'm as great at it as you are, but I
No.
think as a leader, so much happens when you solve a hard problem
Mm-hmm.
together that
Right.
gets you bound and committed because you're sort of on a mission together. And by virtue of being on that mission, you
Right.
then end up with these kind of unbreakable bonds, which is pretty cool.
Right. Choose possibility. So where did this book come from? And what's your main message and
Uh,
reason that you wrote it?
well, I've been wanting to write this book for almost 10 years. And I think the main reason I wrote it is as follows. Most people, I think, have an ill conceived notion of what risk is. And you say, well, what does that mean? I'm like, what I observe when people ask me how I'm successful or what have you, is they want to identify the single choice I made, the single choice, because they imagine. And by the way, all the stories of risk we celebrate seem quite binary from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Like think about all the risk takers you celebrate,
Mm-hmm.
or like look to. People think of people as mighty risk takers, and they must have been one choice that was the difference between success and failure.
Right.
And I was like, not really. If
Mm.
I thought that there was just one choice, I'd put a lot of my pressure on myself to get it right. And by the way, I did. But what I really found throughout my career is it was about my commitment to continually choosing that I found success. So I'd say if you looked at any single choice I made, some might fail, some might succeed, right? So if you measure yourself on a one time choice, it's very hard
Mm-hmm.
to think about becoming a risk taker. But if you feel like risk taking is about the inevitability that the relationship between risk and reward is actually far from linear, it's not the bigger risk you take, the bigger the reward. It's that
Mm-hmm.
you start choosing and you keep choosing. And there's probably 100 or 1,000 choices between you and the ultimate reward.
Mm-hmm.
And so choosing is not about choosing once. Choosing is about continuing to choose the next possibility. And that's how success unlocks. It's not a single choice, it's not binary. And I call that the myth of the single choice. People
Mm-hmm.
live on this like one perfect choice they're going to make, one perfect risk, one massive risk between abject failure and like immense
Mm-hmm.
success. And I'm like, it doesn't really like unwind that way. And I
No,
only
and,
know that
and
because I've made hundreds of choices and taken hundreds of risks.
right. And all those choices influence the quality. All the small choices influence the quality of the big choices you get to make.
You got it, right? And like, so why would you think? So if you think that the between you and success is a big choice, it's and a big failure, it's pretty daunting. You never
Yeah.
choose. You just think, I'll choose tomorrow. I will make a more perfect choice tomorrow. I will like you keep kicking the can down the road because you
Yeah.
think you have
Or
to
the world will
make
make a choice for you.
yeah, and that's the problem, right? If you
Right.
keep like the world makes a choice for you.
Right.
And so you can't really avoid risk. You might as well embrace risk, but not risk as a one-off, risk as a process. That's the main message of the book.
I love
Risk
that.
is a process, not as a one-off. It's a learnable skill. and there is repeatable things you can learn about how to become a great risk taker. That doesn't mean you win every time. It means you get compounding benefits and you win overall.
That's right.
And I don't think people think about choice that way. I think they put a lot of pressure on the first choice.
Yeah,
And
you're right.
they
And
don't.
we talked about just before we started about how I think I read a stat recently, like 40 some odd percent of people are wanting to change their careers right now
Yes.
because of the pandemic. They've had a lot of time to think,
Yeah.
they've had to face a lot of suffering, and that causes us to think what's important in my life. So, but it's risky, right?
It's risky,
There's
right?
financial risk, there's reputational risk, there's all sorts of things. So I think right now more than ever, we need to learn how to be risk tolerant. Right?
Well, here's the irony of the whole thing. I sold this book before the pandemic. Like literally, we had sold StubHub, announced the sale. I was actually, quite frankly, it was a great outcome for the company, but I was sad because I wasn't going to get to be CEO of the consolidated company, right? Very clear that when you're the acquired, like as the CEO of the company that got acquired, you may come or go. And in that case, I wasn't, and I was disappointed. I was 2 years into the job. We were just getting started.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to write this book, and I sold the book before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened. And two things became true in the pandemic that make this book even more relevant than ever. Number one, when we're looking to avoid harm, we often become more agile and risk taking than we are when we're safe. So let's just think about that for a moment, right? You try and build like a culture where people take risks when they're safe and they have every reason to, but they can imagine all the downside. And then comes the day when you have what's called a coconut event. And they're more, coconut event is literally, it's a research term.
The coconut falls on your head.
You got it, and kills you, right? And you so people think coconut events never happen, but unfortunately they actually do happen more often than you think. But the coconut event comes, and all of a sudden you have to respond. And people learn their agility and their real ability to take risks and make fast decisions and choices when they're trying to avoid harm, right? So it's ironic that when we want to achieve ambitions, we're afraid to take risks. Yet when we're forced between, having further harm or doing nothing, we pivot and find our way out, right? And we learn our agility. So I would say the reason this book is so relevant is like COVID taught us a lot about our ability to respond and be agile and take risks at the threat of further harm. Yet most risk-taking opportunities we have in our day-to-day lives are for upside, yet we fail to take them. So I'm like, okay, this is your moment. You've learned something about your ability to be agile and take risks, yes, to avoid harm. But in that, there's the opportunity. It's like, okay, well, now you have an opportunity to take risk for the upside again. So what do you do?
That's interesting. What are some of the actionable steps that you offer readers, to help them learn to take risks?
Well, I kind of, the book moves in, has like kind of three sort of main, I would say, areas of focus. Number one is get going. How do you, like, literally, to your point, get going? And I often say to people, like, number one, you've got to find an opportunity to take risks every day. And people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, I don't have a big career ambition every day. I'm like, well, hold on. Like, let's just break this down. You can take risks for one of four reasons. Achieve an ambition. That's what most people think about. To learn. Risks to learn are almost never a wrong risk. Discovery, like literally discovery of opportunity. Before you make the big choice, what risks are you taking to discover what's possible? People don't really consider that a risk, but I'd be like, you could make that choice today. Like, it's not even asking you to choose yet. It's just asking you to invest a little bit of time to discover, right? It's not even a big risk to take. And then fourth, to avoid harm. Like, that's what we think about, like what we just went through with the pandemic. We had to make a quick action to avoid harm. So number one, I was like, find reasons to take risks today. I've just given you four. Like, you should be able to find a micro risk that you can take today and start practicing. Number two, I always say to people, I would say, if you don't know quite what to do, get proximate before you start planning. Most people think that, like, taking a risk starts with a plan, and they create a plan and write it down and, have this perfect plan, and they research and so on. But it's pretty abstract, right? So if you don't even know yet what to do, I'm like, get proximate to something you're interested in.
Right.
Like, that's it. Get proximate. You want to be an entrepreneur? Get proximate. You can read a book. You can go, spend an evening at an incubator and listen. You can, shadow with a friend who's starting a company, moonlight. Like, whatever you're going to do, get proximate, because it turns out that we don't know how to achieve what we want to achieve. Getting proximate gets you a lot of data. It's just a risk of your time, right?
I love that. Yeah.
And
Could I
then,
pause there? Two quick things that come to me
yes,
from my SEAL training. One is this idea that no plan survives contact with the enemy. The enemy gets to make a choice, right? So why spend all the time planning when it's
yes,
not going to make any sense anyways, as soon as you execute it? And then the other one is doubt is eliminated through action. So
yes,
that's like getting proximate. That's the same
you
thing.
got
Like,
it. Getting
go
proximate.
toward the sound of the gunfire. That's where the answers are. It's not running in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. And then the third way to get started is sort of what you noted is I said, if you put proximity before planning, well, then you're like, well, what's the plan? I was like, the best plan to me is a whiteboard plan. Like it could be on your iPhone, it could be on a whiteboard. I
Right.
mean, a whiteboard or an iPhone, it is meant to be erased and modified as you go. Like, do you know what I mean? It's the absence of these like long detailed plans.
Right.
People put in OKRs and objectives and key results and quarterly plans and annual
Yeah.
planning. I'm like, well, what happened if your plan was like literally a whiteboard plan or an iPhone plan? And then
Right.
you can keep modifying it to your point as you go, right?
Right.
So those are some of the tips. And then the middle of the book is really getting smarter, how to become a really calculated risk taker as you
Mhm.
start to contemplate bigger choices. And then the third part of the book is really like the models, how to reframe your mental model for once you've made a big choice, how to, optimize your execution. Those are other risks we take, execution risk,
Mhm.
to really have the impact we want once we've made a big choice.
Mhm.
And then also the way risk and reward unfolds. It's like not quite the linear relationship you imagine, but there are patterns to how it
Mhm.
unfolds. So those are some of the things we talk about in the book.
In reframing your mental model, like what are some of the frames that you found to be really effective?
Well, it's ironic that I say to people, I just, went through obviously the StubHub CEO experience and then the sale and then the pandemic. And it's really weird if you were to look at that cycle of my life and then rewind and if I were to put my career arcs, highlights and lowlights on a graph,
Mhm.
you would find pretty quickly that it looks a lot like a sine wave.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it doesn't look like people want to call it a straight line
Mhm.
because it's easier to just look at the peaks, right? But if I were to show you the graph of my career, it's a sine wave. So
Yeah.
like the first mental model
Same
is
way,
like,
right? Yeah.
it's the same freaking sine wave, just repeating.
Yeah.
And yes, over the course of my career, that sine wave is up and to the right. It's not lateral.
Right.
But right, but it's a series of repeating experiences. This is why I say like risk is a process and it is repeatable. And your goal is obviously over the course of a lifetime to be moving up and to the right with your choices
Mhm.
and having increased impact with your choice set. But you
Mhm.
will still experience the same volatility in your career.
Mhm.
You think volatility goes away the more senior you get? It doesn't.
It does not, does it? Uh-huh.
It keeps repeating, but it repeats in an arc that gives you some confidence at your low points that there is an end that will
Mhm.
come. And at your high points, it sort of reminds you you're not all that you think you are. So, like,
Mhm.
buyer beware if like you think it's all about you. Like,
Right.
COVID will come along and knock you on your ass and remind you that you're not nearly as great as you think you are.
Right.
But then it will also teach you that you can recover and you have way more skills than you thought possible in times of difficulty.
Right. This is more interesting than anything else, but you're Indian by your heritage. The
Yes.
yogi tradition says or claims that these ups and downs in our lives happen in like roughly 7-year increments or 7-year timeframes. And when I've looked at my life, I'm like, it's kind of proven to be sort of like 6 to 8 years. I'm riding a high, and then all of a sudden, there's kind of like this
So
valley I
funny
start
you say
descend
that.
into.
I'm like, it's so funny you say this. I would say when people ask me my cycles, they're typically 5 to 7 years.
There,
So
yeah.
yeah,
It's going to be a little
cyclicality.
bit different for everybody, but that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably the one framework that I feel like is true in thinking about how it unfolds. Now, again, like I think the challenge for most people listening to a podcast or reading a book is like, okay, this is all well and good,
Right.
but give me some pragmatic tips for how I
Right.
navigate it, right?
Right.
And so hopefully there are both frameworks, but more importantly, there's things you can do to build this muscle. But trusting in the cycles is an important thing to recognize.
Right. And the sine wave doesn't slant upwards unless you have that relentless commitment to learning, from both the
Absolutely,
down cycles as well as the up cycles. Because then,
absolutely,
then the decisions become a little bit more refined every time. You still, like you said, you still have the ups and downs, but the
yeah.
decisions are more refined for whatever you're trying to execute to achieve.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, there's one other thing that's really important in cycles, right? It goes up and to the right because you have to play a game of probabilities. So
Right.
I'm like, you have to be focused in any given cycle. You know this. You want to
Mhm.
make a choice, maximize its impact, get to the reward you imagined or a different reward or impact, but you're playing through a cycle with focus, right?
Mhm.
Any given cycle. But it's true that the best, like the people who are successful in any realm, like whether you're an NBA athlete, whether you're playing Major League Baseball, whether you're a SEAL, whether you're a CEO, right? Enduringly, there are probabilities. So this
Hmm.
doesn't like this means that when you have to play through enough cycles to have a winning season, like
Right.
it's not one game, right?
Right.
And that doesn't mean the probabilities don't matter. Like if your win-loss ratio is like, not in the upper quartile of whatever you're playing, yeah, your career can go sideways. So you are playing to win, make no mistake. But you have to understand that probabilities might be 3 out of 10, might be a winning, like maybe a winning season if you're, or winning game, winning batting average if you're a baseball player. You know, the odds are just different in any given category in which you play. So it doesn't mean you
Hmm.
have to be perfect, right? It just means that at the top of your game, you need to understand their probabilities, but it's all dependent on how many at bats you get and take, and then
Right.
how you optimize each at bat.
That's fascinating. So what's next for you?
I don't know. I love to lead, so I'm sure there will be one more cycle of leadership for me and another
Right.
leadership challenge. As I noted, um I loved running StubHub. I've loved every leadership opportunity I've had.
Hmm.
I love being an entrepreneur. So yeah, I have one more in me at least.
Hmm.
I don't know what it is yet I'll run next, but I'm excited to figure that out. And I mostly wanted to I used my COVID time to really do something else that was meaningful for me, which was
Right.
write this book, right? To
Right.
really, before that next chapter begins, I felt like this might be my opportunity to put pen to paper on, these ideas that hopefully can unlock for other people the kind of success they want to have across a career.
Right. You know, obviously you're very passionate about leadership and growing organizations and the people and the mission. What would you consider to be like your impact mission? Like if you were to pan out and say, how am I making the world a better place? What would you consider that to be?
Um, I'd say two things. First of all, I love building services that empower, delight users. And, in some
Yeah.
cases, those have been startups that succeeded like Yodely or didn't make all their impact like Joyous, but were the first of their kind,
Hmm.
or went all the way, right? Right. I
Hmm.
mean, I've had all sorts of experiences where been able to build services that were either the first of their kind or actually went on to be the winning service,
Hmm. Hmm.
that changed people's lives in either a happiness way. Like I love platforms that purely delight people, make people happy. Joyce made people happy through shopping. StubHub made people happy through live experiences. Yodely empowered people in their financial lives. Like
Hmm.
the board list empowers people to, get access to leadership opportunity or underrepresented. So
Hmm.
I just love creating services like that. So that's
Hmm.
sort of like, that's one level of impact I hope that I've had.
Hmm.
But the second is as important in running organizations and teams and being a leader. I really hope that my impact has been that I got to work with a tremendous number of tremendously talented people and accelerate their impact. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
that gives me a lot of joy to feel like it's not that I feel like really privileged to work with really smart, awesome people in almost
Hmm.
every job I've been at. Privileged to be their leader,
Hmm.
but also feel like my unique opportunity is to help them accelerate their own journey, right? And if I've been a part of that, that makes me feel good. Like it makes me feel good that maybe one day people will say like, oh, okay, I was going to get there anyway, but Sukhinder helped me get there faster, or
Right.
something that she said unlocked, or I would like that to be the other impact that I
Yeah.
could point to at the end of my life.
That's awesome. Sounds like you're already doing that. So
Fingers crossed. Hope so.
choosepossibility.com. Is that the a website that people can learn about the book?
Yeah, they can learn about the book. You can take a risk taking quiz on your natural style as a risk taker. Just
Awesome.
get yourself thinking about how to do it. You can obviously buy the book, or download the book. If you
Yeah.
like Audible.
Hmm.
It's out August 17th, and most importantly, I hope it gets people thinking about how to unlock their own journey.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your contribution and for being on the Unbeatable Mind podcast, Sukhinder. It's just been a delightful conversation. Really
Thanks
appreciate
so
you.
much. I
Yeah. Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Hoo-yah. All right, folks, that's Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. Check out her book, Choose Possibility. You can learn more at choosepossibility.com. Take her risk-taking profile. Yeah, let's go improve our chances of having better possibilities. So we have
Definitely.
that upward arc, continue our growth. And until next time, thanks for being here. Thanks for your support. This is the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Stay focused and be unbeatable. Divine out. Hoo-yah.